Hello and welcome to your first video lesson in English for your basic course in Q1. This is our new way of teaching and learning, hopefully not for long. And this is your first video. And today I would like to talk to you about the novel in general and especially about the genre of the novel. Genre is the English word for Gattung in German. It's a genre. So that means what kind of novel is it actually we're dealing with. And please remember that when you're talking about Fahrenheit 451, that it's a novel. Yeah, please talk about the novel and not the book, because novel is much more specific. Great. So, what kind of genre is Fahrenheit 451? You have maybe already thought about that or not. It's called science fiction. This is what we're dealing with here. It's a genre of science fiction, and science fiction is actually made up of two parts, obviously, science and fiction. And before I go on, I would like you to stop the video here and think a bit about what science fiction is. So what in your idea is a novel that is called science fiction? And if you've thought about that a bit, you can resume the video and then you will see what my ideas are to the topic. Okay, here we go again. So science fiction. The word science, of course, here refers to what we call in English natural sciences. Yeah, natural sciences as in biology, physics, chemistry, and basically this science part refers to the part of novels, stories which deal with technology. Yeah, they deal with advancement in technology that we don't yet have. They deal with computers and general ideas about the future. So science fiction basically are stories about the future. Now the fiction part is also quite obvious. Yeah, we're talking about something that is made up. It's a story. It's not a non-fictional text. It's not a factual text. It's not an informational text. It's a story. Somebody is telling you the story with lots of imagination, usually, about the future. And these stories usually involve lots of technology. They involve modern computers, advancement. They're about science, developments and biology and that kind of thing. And before we go a bit further into this idea of science fiction and where it comes from and famous novelists and so on, I would like you again to think about that a bit, to think about the future. And I want you to think a bit about your own ideas about the future. So maybe, especially now, might be quite interesting. Because at the moment, we're living in a time where everything is uncertain. So probably you're thinking a lot about the future at the moment. And I just wanted to encourage you to think a bit about that. So what do you think is the world going to be like in 100 years? How will we live? How will your grandchildren be educated? What work will you do? How will society be organized? What will politics be like? Will we be all wiped out by a vicious virus like the coronavirus? Or maybe there's no school anymore, there's only homeschooling. I don't know. Okay, so take a couple of minutes to think about that. And after that, you resume the video. So you hit pause now, think a bit about that, and then we will go on after a while. Right, back again to the ideas that other people had about the future. So let's have a look at that a bit. I will tell you something about that, and maybe you already know something, so I don't know. Because this has been going on for quite a long time already. People always had ideas about the future and the future world and what the world is going to be like. And the oldest of these ideas that we know about already were developed by the ancient Greeks. You maybe have heard about the ancient Greeks. And for example, Plato, he was a great one for thinking about what might happen in the future and what future worlds might be look like. And another quite important figure in that was a person who lived in the 16th century, so meaning 15 something. His name was Thomas More, Sir Thomas More actually. And Sir Thomas More wrote quite an important novel which was called Utopia. And maybe you've heard the term utopia before. You probably have. In German we call that Utopie. And this is actually the name of the novel by Sir Thomas More, written in the 16th century. It's a very famous novel because it coined the term utopia. Utopia actually meaning, it comes from Greek, no place or a good place. And you probably already know that this is an idea of the future, an ideal future where everything is perfect. There is also a term meaning the opposite, which you probably also know. This is called a dystopia. This will be a bad place, something where everything is terrible. A bad vision of the future we will call a dystopia. We will come back to that later on in our course, either in person or per video. We don't know yet. And then we will talk about utopia and dystopia and the terms. But just to go on with that, roughly at the end of the 19th century, science fiction actually became a form of art, meaning that many people suddenly decided that science fiction was their form of literature that they wanted to write. And of course, this is actually sort of the birth of science fiction as a literary form. And you can, of course, ask yourselves, why was it the end of the 19th century? What exactly happened at the end of the 19th century that made people suddenly think so much about the future? And probably you already have the answer, but the answer actually is in this part of technology that is in the term science fiction, that we associated, with technology. Because at that time, technology developed very much. There were much modern inventions, the steam engine, railways, and many other things were suddenly invented very, very fast at the end of the middle of the 19th century. And suddenly technology was everywhere. You could travel much faster. Science was advancing, medicine was advancing. There were lots of new discoveries. And these things just changed the world very much. There was mass production, suddenly there was communication, the telephone, and all these massive scientific progress. And many people just wondered where that might lead to, where will we be going with all these massive scientific changes that were suddenly happening very, very fast. So the world changed much faster than it had before. And lots of people also were quite afraid. They were frightened of the new things that were happening. And this is why many people started thinking about the future, and many novelists and writers started writing about what might happen in the future. And maybe you already know some quite famous novelists of that time. I suppose you know probably the so-called father of science fiction. You probably all know him without knowing that he was the father of science fiction. His name is Jules Verne. And probably you've all heard of him because you all know his stories about 1,000 Miles Under the Sea, or 80 Days Around the World, in 80 Tagen um die Welt. It's quite famous novels, and he wrote many of them, Jules Verne, and became quite famous with them because they were actually the first sort of science fiction novels. And just to give you a short overview about these people who wrote science fiction, there's, for example, H.G. Wells, who wrote many science fiction stories. One of them became quite famous. He wrote a novel called War of the Worlds, and maybe a film which is much more recent, of course, than War of the Worlds. It's called Independence Day, and maybe you know the film Independence Day, which is based on War of the Worlds, actually. There's also quite a funny story about a radio play of War of the Worlds, which you can look up in the internet if you want to. One of the most famous novels, probably, and H.G. Wells, one of the most famous novelists of science fiction. War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, another very famous novel by H.G. Wells, and many, many others. Another author you might come across, because usually the advanced course, the Leistungskurs, is reading him. He's called Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley wrote a novel called Brave New World, which we usually read in the advanced courses. Then there's, of course, George Orwell with 1984, a very important novel, especially probably today. Check out George Orwell in 1984, it's probably worth it. And there are others, called Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Per Anhalter durch die Galaxis in German, or Stanislav Lem, a Russian writer, with his novel Solaris, which was also put into a film. Many science fiction films, of course, which you know much better than me, probably. Okay, so this is a short idea, some ideas about the history of science fiction. If you're interested in reading any of these novels, you should, of course. Especially at the moment, 1984 might be interesting. Or you can do some further studies on Ray Bradbury, the writer of Fahrenheit 451, or any of the other writers. We will later on, as I said, talk a bit more about this term utopia and dystopia, but we will not do that today. The other thing I would like to talk to you about in this video is actually the beginning of your novel, because we have not really talked about it, and it's difficult to do that as a task by your own. The novel that we are reading, Fahrenheit 451, is a novel that deals with one central topic. Now it will be your turn to name the central topic, which I hope is quite clear. It's also about future vision and what might happen in the future, and it's especially about books, of course. Books, and especially about the fact of burning books. Yeah, that's a central idea of the novel, burning books. And maybe it would be a good idea now if you would come up with some thoughts about burning books. So what do you associate that with? So if you do a little mind map, you can do that in your exercise book. And if you've come up with some ideas, you can restart the video and see what my ideas are like. Okay, so stop the video here and create a short, very brief mind map about burning books. Okay, back again. Burning books, what ideas comes to mind? Probably something like censorship. Censorship meaning that somebody censors what is supposed to be published. That means not everyone can publish any book they want to publish, means veröffentlichen. To publish. But there's a censor, or in German ein Zensor, who will decide what will be published and what will not be published. Yeah, that's what's called censorship, which we don't have in Germany at the moment. hopefully. Burning books, of course, also associated with writers, knowledge, maybe ideas that also came to mind were totalitarian system or a dictatorship, a system, political system where there's only one person deciding what to do. Maybe other ideas that came to mind were destruction, and maybe a last one would be ideas for a culture. Maybe you came up with lots of other ideas, very different one from mine. Yeah, it doesn't matter. There's no right or wrong here. This is just what you may have come up with. If we're talking about burning books, dictatorship, totalitarian society, yeah, this is just to make sure that you've got all the words you need. There might be the term to deter, jemanden von etwas abschrecken. Yeah, this is why you usually have a censorship, or why you burn books to stop people from thinking, to stop people from having different ideas. That's the idea behind that usually. Totalitarian system, totalitarianism, yeah, very difficult word. Totalitarismus in German, even difficult in German. Or dictatorship. Dictatorship is the noun, and the dictator is the person who leads the dictatorship. Probably these are words you might want to use when you're talking about burning books, totalitarian societies, and the society of Fahrenheit 451. There might be other ideas you would like to use connected to the word censorship that I've mentioned here. So there's the person who executes censorship, she's called censor, and the verb is also to censor something. You can also call that to ban books, verbieten in this case, or to have a blacklist of book. Also connected to that is a restriction of freedom of thought and freedom of expression. That might be some ideas that come up here. Other words you may find useful are maybe education, literature, music, art. To publish, veröffentlichen, this is what you do with a book. And the person who writes a book or a novel is called a novelist. That's the person who writes the novel. Or you may call him an author or a writer. Okay, if you feel you need other words maybe to talk about what is happening in Fahrenheit 451, maybe about destruction, yeah, you could use the term fire to burst into flames, might be useful. Or to destroy, you know the word destroy. Write it down anyway, to destroy. To annihilate. Annihilate, also a wonderful word to use here in this context. Okay, maybe you still feel that you need some more words. You can add them to your list, to your mind map, to any list of words you might be using for talking about Fahrenheit 451. You may also would like to check the internet on burning books in the past, especially Germany, unfortunately, is quite famous for having a past of burning books. You probably can already imagine when that was happening. And there is also a saying, if they're burning books, they will soon be burning people. You can also check that quotation and find out who is it from. And I will meet you in our next video, where we will talk about, or in which I will talk about with you, about characterization. All right, and this is it for today. This was your first video lesson for this week.